What if one bad ride down a dark highway could destroy your entire life? In this film, fate doesn't just knock, it hunts you down. When people talk about pure noir, this is the film they mean. Cheap, fast, nasty, fatalistic, and absolutely unforgettable. So, let's start at the beginning. Hello to all the classic people who are returning. I'm glad you're back. I want to welcome any new visitors and let you know that there will be spoilers ahead. Today on Classic Movie Review, we are taking on Detour 1945. With a runtime of only 66 minutes, it's amazing how much director Edgar G. Ulmer crammed into this film. IMDb.com rates this film at 7.3, which is a pretty good score for a short film noir. RottenTomatoes.com got it right with 98% on the tomato meter and a 77% audience score. Great film critic Roger Ebert gave this film 4 of 4 stars and placed it on his greatest film list. Ebert said, quote, "Detour is a movie so filled with imperfections that it would not earn the director a passing grade in film school. This movie from Hollywood's Poverty Row, shot in 6 days, remember that, filled with technical errors and ham-handed narratives, starring a man who can only pout and a woman who can only sneer, should have faded from sight soon after it was released in 1945, and yet it lives on, haunting and creepy, an embodiment of the guilty soul of film noir. No one who has seen it has easily forgotten it," unquote. In 1992, the Library of Congress added Detour 1945 to the National Registry of Film, making it the first film noir and B-movie on the list. On my all film noirs list, I have initially slotted this film at 28. This placement puts this film in company with The Postman Always Rings Twice 1946 and Brute Force 1947. Actors. The awesome actress Esther Howard had a tiny role as the diner's waitress. Howard was first covered in the great film noir Born to Kill 1947, where she fought Elisha Cook Jr. with a giant hat pin. There's a link in the description. Tom Neal played doomed Al Roberts. Neal was born in Illinois in 1914. He started out pretty well as a boxer at Northwestern University. In 1935, he won the NCAA Light Heavyweight Boxing Championship. He also made his first appearance on Broadway in 1935. He earned a law degree from Harvard in 1938 and appeared in his first film, Out West with the Hardys, 1938. Neal spent the 40s and 50s appearing regularly in films, often as a tough guy. Some of his film noir roles include The Great Impersonation 1942, The Unseen 1945, Apology for Murder 1945, his masterpiece, today's film Detour 1945, and John Garfield's masterpiece, The Postman Always Rings Twice 1946. Neal had an on-again, off-again relationship with actress Barbara Payton. I spoke about her tragic life in the film noir Trap 1949. There's a link in the description. Neal had a fight with another of Payton's lovers, Francha Tone. As a former boxer, Neal gave Tone a violent thrashing. Hollywood stood by Tone and turned their backs on Neal. He worked in landscaping and other jobs following his informal blacklisting. Payton and Tone were married in 1951. After they married, Tone discovered that Payton and Neal were continuing their affair, and Tone was granted a divorce in 1952. Payton and Neal's relationship essentially ended both of their careers, but they managed to capitalize on some bad press by touring in plays such as The Postman Always Rings Twice, based on the 1946 film of the same name. They also starred in the movie The Great Jesse James Raid 1953. In England that year, Payton co-starred in 2 low-budget pictures for Hammer Films, Four-Sided Triangle and The Flanagan Boy, also known as Bad Blonde. In May 1953, Payton announced that she and Neal were to be married. However, the couple broke up in 1954. In 1965, Neal was charged with murdering his wife Gail by shooting her in the back of the head with a .45 caliber pistol. He was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and received a 10-year sentence. He served 6 years in prison before being released early. He died 8 months later in December 1972. Ann Savage played the role of Vera, and man was she tough. I included Savage in my 2024 November video, and she was initially placed at 29 on the list of greatest femme fatales. Savage was born in South Carolina in 1921. That explains the anger. At age 9, Savage's mother moved the family to Los Angeles. She appeared in local theater and studied at Max Reinhardt's acting school. Ann's first film was One Dangerous Night, 1942. Over her career, she appeared in several crime films that teetered on the edge of film noir. In addition to the above, these films include Murder in Times Square, 1943, and Passport to Suez, 1943. Other film noirs include today's film Detour, 1945, The Spider, 1945, Apology for Murder, 1945, The Last Crooked Mile, 1946, and Pier 23, 1951. Of course, she appeared in westerns, comedies, and dramas as well. Later in her career, Savage worked in television and attended film festivals. She died in 2008. Story. The credits roll over an isolated section of desert roadway. At night, sad sack Al Roberts, Tom Neal, is walking a road. He is shown being given a ride to Reno, Nevada by a stranger. In Reno, he takes his sourpuss face into a diner where he tells his story in flashback, as with all good film noirs. The waitress is played by Esther Howard. A northbound trucker offers Al a ride.
Want anything else?
No.
Al says he is heading east and coming from the west. He picks a fight with the trucker and hands are almost thrown. Al is then snotty with the waitress. The trucker puts a song on the jukebox and Al gets very aggressive. The camera zooms in on his face and he reflects on how the tune from the jukebox follows him. He has an internal pity party before recounting his tale in flashback in the greatest film noir tradition. The song on the jukebox is I Can't Believe That You're in Love With Me. Al says that it was a very popular tune when he worked at the Break of Dawn Club in New York City. Al was a piano player and was in love with singer Sue Harvey, Claudia Drake. However, the work was not making either one of them rich. Al wanted to be a classical pianist. One morning after work, Sue tells Al that she wants to delay their planned marriage until they can both advance their careers. She says she is heading to Hollywood to chase her dream.
Next week we're going to make with the ring and the license. You and me will be a team.
Yes, that's right. In the Bush League.
I don't get you.
We've been struck out.
Al, of course, thinks it's because Sue doesn't love him. He walks away dejected. Without Sue in the club, Al is lost. One night, he decides to call Sue. She is no longer in the music business. She is working as a hash slinger in a restaurant. He tells her to keep her chin up and that he is heading west to see her. He wants to be married as soon as he arrives. Al hitchhikes across the country and uses what little money he has to feed himself. He is beaten and dirty as the trip continues. He makes it to the desert and doggedly continues his journey to California. In Arizona, a man in a convertible gives Al a ride. The driver is a tough-talking, no-nonsense guy named Charles Haskell Jr., Edmund McDonald. Al still feels sorry for himself as he rides in the breeze. Haskell asks for a box from the glove compartment and takes a pill.
Hold the wheel, will you?
Pep pill. They make general conversation, and Haskell says he's going all the way to L.A. Around dark, Al notices 3 deep claw marks on Haskell's hand. Haskell says you can expect something like that when you give a dame a ride. He says she was a monster. Haskell goes for the box again and takes another pill. He tells the story of another scar he has on his arm that he got in a pretend sword fight with another kid. He says that after he was cut, he slashed out and blinded the kid in one eye. He ran away from home and hasn't been home for 15 years. Haskell stops at a cafe and buys Al a meal. Haskell says he's a bookie and that he has an important horse race in California that he needs to attend so he can place a bet. Al drives the rest of the night while Haskell sleeps in the passenger seat. While he drives, Al imagines Sue singing and being a star. When it starts raining, Al tries to wake Haskell, but he can't. When Al opens the passenger door, Haskell falls out the door, hitting his head on a rock. However, he was probably already dead, having died during the night in the desert, just like Grandma in The Grapes of Wrath, 1940. It's likely that Haskell died from the pep pills he was taking on the trip. Other names for the pills are uppers and speed. Al is shown in the original diner where he's telling the story in flashback. He makes it clear that he did not kill Haskell. Al thinks that if he runs, they will think he is guilty. If he stays, they will not believe him. So Al hides the body off the road. He rationalizes taking Haskell's ID, clothes, and money. As he is putting the roof up, a motorcycle cop stops to warn Al not to leave his car parked halfway in the road. The cop leaves without issue. In the morning, Al arrives at the California State Line inspection station. He gives him the stolen ID and is passed through the checkpoint. Al checks into a roadside motel for some much-needed rest. However, he is tortured by dreams of his actions. The next day, he is woken by the maid. Is there any other way to be woken in a motel? Al plans to ditch the car in San Bernardino, then head on to see Sue. There is $700 in Haskell's wallet. He finds a letter written by Haskell, who was planning to swindle his father out of money so he could start a new bookie bank. Al stops to add water to the radiator and sees a woman hitchhiking. She looks rough with windblown hair, dirty clothes, and a frightening scowl on her face. He calls her over for a ride, and she reluctantly accepts.
There was a woman. Hey, you! Come on if you want to ride.
The woman is Vera, Ann Savage. Al thinks she looks like she's been thrown off a freight train. He also thinks she's pretty in a plain way. Her answers are short and snippy. Finally, Vera falls asleep. Al feels sympathy for the hard life that Vera must have had. Vera wakes from her nap and blurts out, "Where'd you leave the body?" She continues that this is not Al's car and that he is not fooling anyone and that he is not Haskell.
Who this dame was, well, it was no business of mine.
Where did you leave his body? Where did you leave the owner of this car? You're not fooling anyone. This buggy belongs to a guy named Haskell.
She says that she rode with Haskell from Shreveport, Louisiana. Al realizes that Vera is the one who put the scratches on Haskell's hand. He feels like the dead Haskell is in the car laughing at him. Al is shown in the original diner, the flashback location, thinking how unlucky it was for him to pick up Vera. If Haskell had just passed him by on the road, or if he had left Vera standing by the road, he wouldn't be in this fix. He tells Vera the true story, but she's hard to reach. She says she's not a friend with the cops, but she takes all of Haskell's money and says she has more use of Al. Vera thinks there's more money because Haskell had told her that he plans to bet $3,000 on the horse in California. Vera is chewing on Al with her eyes wide, demanding that she is in charge and he better not give her any trouble. Vera tells Al that it would be stupid to dump the car as the police would investigate an abandoned car. Vera makes Al stop so she can get a bottle. I thought it was a bottle of shampoo, but it was a bottle of booze. She wants to sell the car in San Bernardino. They make it to Hollywood and check into an apartment as a married couple. She won't let Al out of her sight. She takes the bedroom and leaves Al with a Murphy bed. Vera has a bath and comes out a little calmer. She might be coming on to him, but it's a generally hostile interaction.
Forget it. Have a drink.
Aren't you afraid I might take you up on it?
If I didn't want to give you a drink, I wouldn't have offered it.
They polish off the bottle, and Vera is acting almost normal. She has the keys and has the door locked. She touches his leg, but Al walks away. She gets mad because Al is always pretty down. By 11 p.m., the two are pretty much tired of being together. Vera has a bad cough, and they discuss that it might be consumption, tuberculosis. She makes another play for him before she goes to bed. Al rebuffs her, and Vera gets mad again. With Vera out of the room, Al calls Sue. However, he doesn't say anything when she answers, just hangs up. In the morning, Al from the current time does a voiceover saying that if this was fiction, he would fall in love with Vera or she would make a great sacrifice for him before she died. By noon, Vera is dressed and looking pretty reasonable. They head to a used car dealership. Vera wants a fur coat after they make the sale, but Al just wants to get away from her. The dealer lowballs the offer and Vera gets aggressive. Al finally accepts the dealer's lower price. Al goes inside to sign the papers and Vera cleans out the glove box. She finds something to steal. Suddenly, Vera comes in and says they are not selling the car. She drags Al out and has him drive to a drive-in diner. She explains that he is not off the hook yet.
Get this, Vera. I've been pretty patient so far. I've done everything you asked me to do, but no more.
Shut up.
You've taken Haskell's money. You can have the dough we get from selling the car, but you're not going to keep me a prisoner.
It's a good thing I bought the paper. Take a look at that.
Vera, I'm in no mood.
Read that.
Vera has a newspaper that says Charles J. Haskell Sr. is dying and efforts are being made to find his son, Charles J. Haskell Jr. Al wants nothing to do with the scheme. Vera is convinced that Al can pass as Charles Jr. Charles Sr. has a $15 million fortune and Vera wants it. She says they will wait until Sr. dies and then split the money. Back at the apartment, the two play cards, but the tension is thick. Al says he will rat her out if they get caught in the fraud. Vera says she's already dying and an execution would just speed things up. Vera threatens to call the cops on Al. He bluffs her, saying he will take her down with him. She calls information for the police station number, because that's what you had to do back in the day before 911. Call up the operator. Hello, operator, I need the police. Is it an emergency? Yes, ma'am. But you're a child. It's still an emergency. Are you sure? Al breaks first and stops her from calling. As the night continues, the fighting increases. Al makes logical arguments for not going forward with the fraud.
Boy, for that kind of dough, I'd let you cut my leg off.
You're drunk and you're crazy mad, Vera. Turn me in if you want to, but I won't get mixed up in this. Besides, how do we know Haskell was such a phony? Maybe it wasn't the man's son at all. Maybe he just dreamed it up.
Vera is drunk and Al roughs her up. First she's pitiful, but quickly returns to being mean.
You hurt me.
I'm sorry, but...
And it's hot in here. Open up a window.
Vera locks herself in the bedroom with the phone. This was the time when phones came with long cords so you could use them in different parts of the house. If a girl called you, you could drag the phone cord to the kitchen and hide in there while you try to get some privacy. Al tugs on the cord that is still in his room, trying to stop Vera from calling. Eventually, he breaks into the bedroom and finds Vera dead. The cord was wrapped around her neck. When he pulled the cord, he accidentally strangled her. Al begins to talk in current time. He says that with one killing, they might believe him, but with two killings, he would have no chance. Al knows it's useless to even clean up because too many people have seen the couple together.
I could burn clothes and hide bottles for the next 5 years. There'd always be witnesses. The landlady, for one. She could identify me. The car dealer, the waitress in the drive-in, the girl in the dress shop, and that guy in the liquor store. They could all identify me.
He decides to make a run for it. Al is shown back in the diner where he began telling the story. He says that when he got to Bakersfield, I've been to Bakersfield, I don't recommend it, it was reported that Vera had been murdered and the police were looking for Charles Haskell Jr. Al goes outside, gets back on the road to continue moving east. Soon, a highway patrol car arrives and picks him up. Al blames fate for his arrest as he caught a ride with Haskell and gave one to Vera. Conclusion: this movie from a Poverty Row studio was really put together on a shoestring. The 1941 Lincoln Continental V12 convertible that Haskell drove belonged to director Ulmer. The director had Al play classical tunes by Chopin and Brahms so that they wouldn't have to pay licensing fees. The sweater that Vera was wearing when she first appeared belonged to Ulmer's wife. They made it fit Ann Savage by cinching it up with pins. When they were getting ready to film the hitchhiking scene, a car stopped and tried to give Savage a ride. I guess the pins worked. This film was shot on a quick 28-day schedule, not a 7-day schedule as sometimes rumored. A lot of the film was shot in the hotel room and in a car with a rear projection on a soundstage. The murder of Vera by Al at the end of the film was not in the original script. Director Ulmer added it just before filming began. Also, Al's arrest at the end of the film was forced in by Joseph Breen of the Production Code Administration because murderers could not be seen to get away with their crimes. I don't think I can really convey how mean Ann Savage made Vera. She was a master femme fatale using the talent she had. Based on the strength of this role, I am moving Ann Savage as Vera to number 3 on my greatest femme fatale list. Check it out. World famous short summary: if you see Vera coming, you better get to running. Thank you for taking the time to listen. If you want more, be sure to subscribe, hit the like, and ring the bell. Beware the Moors.